Well, here we are on the meaning code, and I've got Paula Boddington, Dr. Paula Boddington, back with me again today. I'm so excited. She's an associate professor of philosophy and healthcare at the University of West London. And Paula has a kind of a special aspect of thinking a lot about AI. And so today we're going to tackle the issue of reality and what it means to be human in terms of reality, and maybe we can give ourselves a little bit of an edge on the coming AI revolution. So,
equipped.
Yeah, great to be here with you, Paula. So one of the reasons we're talking is that I've been reading this book, Love and the Postmodern Predicament. Here, Love and the Postmodern Predicament. And it's by D C Schindler, who has written a lot of really great stuff, especially he has a lot of online YouTube videos about this whole issue of love, and makes for very thoughtful consideration. And so I had sent Paula 2 pages that really struck me. And I think one of the ways we could approach this is I'll just read a little bit and then we'll talk about it, and then and kind of see what we can make of it, because it's too much to try to summarize the whole thing briefly. It's kind of a big concept. So this is, I don't know what page it is. It's 15% of the way through the book, because I'm working off of a Kindle.
I found it by checking the index. It's in the introduction. So it's page 2 and 3 from the introduction.
Okay. So this is right when I first started reading the book. Whatever the physiological mechanisms might be through which sense experience occurs, what it is most fundamentally is a direct encounter with things in the world we inhabit. In sense experience, we make contact with reality. To put the matter more poetically, perhaps, we might say that the senses are the 5 gateways through which reality enters into one's soul. For Aristotle, we can draw an inference about why we know from our experience of sensation, because both knowing and sensing are forms of contact with the real. Let's just start there.
Yes, so that's and I said I'd get the book, and I haven't had time to read it, so I don't know what else he makes of it, but from there you could start.
Well, I think this is enough, right?
Yeah,
you could probably write a whole book about that thing there, but let's just talk about that.
Yes, you probably could make a whole book about it. I was thinking about it. I was thinking about it in terms of, because we were thinking about it in terms of the current era and in AI, and in terms of how we access the world through technology. So I was thinking about it in those terms, but also thinking in terms of just some of the history of approaches in philosophy, thinking through, actually not through the postmodern tradition, but just through what's become the standard philosophers that you get taught about in teaching Western philosophy in universities. So contrasting, actually, say, an approach like Descartes from a rationalist's approach to reality with that Hume representing the empiricists. And I was particularly thinking about Hume because I think that Hume has been incredibly influential in the sorts of thinking that actually went into building computers and to thinking about some of the modern approaches to ethics, like he's seen as a proto-utilitarian. So in terms of saying in sense experience we make contact with reality, I mean, one of the things that's really characteristic of the thinkers of the Enlightenment is trying to place reality on a sense of certainty. So I mentioned in the letter that I wrote back to you in the sort of email I sent back, Descartes' approach, which could be a rationalist approach. I just thought it might just be useful to contrast the two, because we can see really different ways of looking at it. But what happens is there's a role for wondering if the senses are really real, and you have a role for the self, which is construed in very different ways in the two philosophers. And So the relationship between the senses and the self and reality is like one of the critical things that's happening, that's falling apart and being distorted, I think, in the sort of current, postmodern world, and in how we see the world through technology. So this is going to be a very rough and ready account of
well, this is going to be really good for me because I'm always reading stuff about, well, Descartes was a rationalist and Hume was an empiricist, and I kind of get the basic concept there, but I never studied philosophy to the extent of being able to break that apart and understand why it's a problem. Now, I can certainly see why Hume is a problem, because in your letter to me, you said, and we're going to discuss empiricism, because I think there's two sides to that too, probably 100 sides, but anyway, you said there is that in David Hume's empiricism, which sees the source of our knowledge as the empirical world. But he describes this in terms of the sensations reaching us. And then you said, since he can find no ground for order in causation, nor in inductive reasoning, nor even a principle ordering and unifying the self, which is just a bundle of perceptions, precisely because he's splitting his experience into separate momentary sensations, this grounding in the empirical world becomes at the same time a divorce from it. Now, I thought that was really important, because this idea that there is a good side to empiricism, there's a necessary side to empiricism, but you can be grounded in it in a way that actually causes you to be divorced from the world. So I wondered if you could expand a little bit on what you said there. You said Hume can find no ground for order in causation. Why is that?
Okay, so can I backtrack a little bit? Can I first of all just very quickly fill in Descartes, because he's such a contrast to you. I'll do that more quickly because we won't talk about him so much. So Descartes famously set out to try to ground his knowledge on certainty, and he had a program of radical doubt, of trying to doubt everything that he knew, because he thought if he tested it through the method of doubt, he would find something he could be really certain of, and then on that basis of certainty build his knowledge up. So he started off by doubting all his sense perceptions. So noting that we often do make mistakes. So you might see something in the distance and think it's something, and when we get close, we find it's not quite how we saw it. And he thought that maybe everything we're seeing is really a dream, and that maybe we're being tricked, even maybe if we think that 2 + 2 is 4, maybe a demon has tricked us about that. But then comes down to thinking his famous cogito, the cogito ergo sum, thinking at the time that he's doubting, he's definitely thinking. So that's something he cannot possibly doubt, that he is a thinking thing. So that I think, therefore I am. So the basis for his knowledge is his certainty about his self. Now, he's been criticised for that, because he doesn't know that he's a whole thing. So he makes a self out of just this thought, but the basis of it is a thought. And from that, he finds in his mind that he has an idea of God, and his idea of God is a perfect being. And if the being is perfect, he would never set out to trick us all. And so he can roughly trust all his senses. So he might make a few mistakes, but on the whole, the sensory world can be trusted. So that it's all built up. You get to trusting the senses through this inner certainty from himself, and then from that from God. Whereas in Hume's account of how...
Okay, hold on a second, though. That's really helpful, because I've always wondered why. But a lot of people say, but Descartes was the first wrench in between the old world and the modern world. He was the first one that kind of sliced through and separated us from the grounding that we had before. So what part of what he said is what caused that wrenching? I mean, a lot of people blame the Descartes, the Cartesian world for a lot of things. Why did they blame the Cartesian world?
Well, there was a radical separation between mind and body, because he was just simply thought. He was just simply his essence. He said our essence is just purely mental. So he thought there was like mental substance and physical substance, and our essence is simply thought. So that's one of the wrenches, because there's a big separation between mind and body, which we also find in, well, I think we haven't really. I mean, it's one of the problems that we're dealing with now. Actually, the big radical separation from the body. Mm-hmm. So Descartes himself grappled with it. Actually, he's got a very famous correspondence with Princess Elizabeth of Denmark, I think she was, she was asking him all these questions about, as if it's like this silly woman doesn't really understand, but she was asking him all these, how can it be? How are we actually joined to our bodies? So Descartes thought that our mind was joined to our body somehow in the pineal gland, which has actually got some particular role in consciousness. But he thought that there was like this mental substance. So the 20th century philosopher Gilbert Ryle famously dubbed this the ghost in the machine. So it's as if we are machines with this ghostly mental stuff animating it. So that would be certainly a break with many ways of thinking, a great divorce from the body. But Descartes realized this was a problem. So he said, for example, how can we explain how the mind and body are coordinated? He actually said, I am not in my body as a captain is in a ship. So it's your experience is not as if you are just sitting there somehow steering your body. It's much more connected than that. But he also did these absolutely terrible, in order to try to demonstrate, he would do these terrible vivisections on animals. He went around doing these shows where he would like show the nerves of the animals and sort of demonstrate that you could get the animal to move, and yet the animal didn't feel any pain, and people were fainting in the audience.
Yeah, I would be fainting too. Well, okay, let's move on to Hume. I will come back to Descartes because there's a big issue here. I'm going to talk a little bit about the researcher Michael Levin and his work with bioelectric signaling, and we'll come back to Descartes on that. So
so I think, but a real fracturing between the mind and the body, but so Hume was an empiricist and thought that all of our knowledge about the world comes through our senses. So he divided knowledge into two branches. One would be matters of fact, matters of empirical fact, which we get entirely through the senses, and the others would be reasoning concerning quantity and number, so mathematics or mathematics or logic, or when you're making comparisons between things. So he thought those were the only two possible sources of our knowledge. But his account of perception was actually really simply passive. So he just thought that we would get impressions from the world, and from these impressions we would have ideas which were just simply copies of our impressions. So, for example, you're wearing a blue cardigan or a top, and I'd get an impression of blue, and then I form the idea of blue in my mind, like a very passive copying process. So that we just simply get those ideas. Or our mind is like as if our mind is a photocopier. Not that he had a concept of a photocopy, but it's as if we're just simply passively receiving these things. And so they're all, in a sense, as if there's lots of separate sense data which just falls into our minds. And then we can
like our mind is a reverse projector almost.
Yeah. So we can then form new ideas. So, for example, we can form an idea of a unicorn, because we can get an idea of a horn, an idea of a horse, and put them together in our minds.
Well, so that's very like what they're trying to get AI to do.
Yes. Just put stuff together. But also he thought we were just getting impressions of facts in the world, and his account of morality is simply that anytime we see something happening in the world, so for example, we might see somebody being murdered or somebody committing adultery or something. I think that's one of his examples. We can't actually see the wrongness in the world. We just turn to our own breast and find we have a sensation of dislike or disapproval, and it's entirely inside our own breast. So it's entirely subjective. So we simply have these inner judgments, inner subjective judgments about everything, and there's nothing out in the world. So a big distinction between fact and value.
So if I don't happen to have that feeling of discomfort, then then there's nothing wrong with whatever it was.
Yes, yes, but he'd also just thought that basically people were all pretty nice. So we thought we basically.
So he was kind of like Sam Harris. He sort of thinks that people will naturally be compassionate and decent.
Yes, yes. So you get natural sympathy, and then you get natural virtues, and then artificial virtues, which would be we get together in society and work out we ought to have laws and we ought to have particular ways of doing things, and they would be artificial virtues that we'd come together and decide upon. So they could vary from place to place, but we had this natural sympathy for each other. So
here's a question that always fascinates me about these guys that were thinkers. In the ordinary course of events, somebody could have ideas like that and nobody would ever care anything about what they thought because they're just thinking it, or even it could be written in a book. There's millions of books written every year. Why did Hume stand out to such an extent that he not only was listened to, but he's actually become the foundation for generations and generations of people that are absolutely like Hume is the greatest ever. So what was it about him?
Well, actually, I don't really know. I mean, his early books, his first books, he famously described as having fallen dead born from the press. But I think it sold about 4 copies. So it took a while before he came to any attention. But actually, I actually don't.
Kind of power in his ideas, though, because that concept that you just laid out to me has. That's like the foundation of 80% of our culture right now, you know?
Yes, it is. It's incredibly influential. So many, like Sam Harris's of the world, they all think that value just lies entirely in how we think. The whole of artificial intelligence, or the basic idea behind most of it, is based upon the idea that, well, Hume's account of rationality, of reason, was entirely instrumental. So any value in reason we put in there. So when we reason, we just reason instrumentally. So we can reason in morality about how to achieve the ends that we want. So if you reason that it would be a good thing to go to somebody's aid over something, then you can reason in terms of how to achieve that, but you can't reason about whether it would be good to help somebody. That's something which is entirely subjective. So it's an entirely instrumental account of rationality. And the notion of intelligence, which is dominant in those building artificial intelligence, is likewise an instrumental account of intelligence. So intelligence would be defined as being able to efficiently achieve your goals. But the goals are going to have to be put into the machine by us. So those are going to be based upon, and many of the leading people working in AI literally say, based upon our preferences and our desires. So it's literally very much a Humean account of what's going on.
Well, so if we go back to Hume's idea that, and I'm trying to find a section in this book here that I thought really stood out to me. Regarding Hume's ideas, I'm going to read this. This is from page 30 at the end of chapter 1 from this book, Love and the Postmodern Predicament. I think I have to go back one page to get the end of the sentence. According to Aquinas, goodness and truth and beauty are properties of being, but specifically those properties that concern the relationship of being to the human soul. They are an encounter with reality, in other words, that concerns the meaning of being as such and the essence of man. Now here's the sentence. Everything that exists is real, but man is the only creature in the physical universe that is capable of experiencing the real precisely as real. To experience reality is a great gift, but at the same time, a daunting task with a lot at stake. It is not too much to say that if man establishes as a basic cultural purpose to shield himself from reality so as to render the things of the world vulnerable to him, then reality will simply cease to be, no matter how much stuff might still be around. Now, I had to think about that for a minute. to shield himself from reality so as to render the things of the world vulnerable to him. So what Hume is doing is basically shielding himself from reality, not acknowledging reality. And I'm going to make a very I guess it would be a theological statement that reality includes human sin. That's the nature of reality. Humans sin.
Yeah.
And Hume was shielding himself from that reality so as to make the world vulnerable to himself. In other words, if I can deny that human sin exists, then I can manipulate the world to meet my standards. I can build a utopia. I can have completeness without consistency. Right?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. So it. Yes, I'll have to read the book. It sounds really interesting. But so in terms of Hume, I think I mentioned before in the letter. So Hume's account of causation, I'll just backtrack and fill that in a bit because
the causation.
how much he really dismantles. So his account of causation, I think philosophers will argue exactly about how to interpret exactly what he says. But he says that when we look at the world, the way in which he looks at the world is very fragmented, which one of the reasons why I think it's really important to look at Hume, because I think that's what's happening to so many people now, is that the world is fragmented in lots of different ways. So if you look at, say, two billiard balls on a billiard table and one hits in the other, so all you see is one move and then the other move. You don't ever see the causation. So that when you'll find a sort of what he called a constant conjunction, so that you'll find that every time I've got some got some tea in here, if I tip it upside down, it will go all over the computer every time. That's what's going to happen. So you just do one thing and you get a constant effect that we can observe. So we don't know for certain that's going to happen. So that's the first doubt of certainty, because there's uncertainty in knowledge by induction in that way. But that's all that causation is. There's no cause out there in the world that we can see. So that notion of reality is dismantled. But also
you can see consequences, but you can't see causes.
You can't see the cause. You just see one thing happen and then another happen. So you hit one billiard ball, you hold a ball up and it drops, hold another ball up and it drops. So there's a constant. We observe this happens and the next thing happens and the next thing happens. But we don't.
If you don't have any certainty about that, then how could empiricism be a valuable method of scientific study?
Well, I suppose to have a valuable method of scientific study, you would still just go and repeat the experiment and change the different conditions and see what happened in the different conditions. And he himself was saying that when you have these skeptical doubts, you can get all terribly worried about it. But his response to that was just, oh, just go about your daily life and you stop worrying. So he's had this very genial nature. He's one of a few philosophers from the past that you would even consider inviting to dinner, because he was apparently a very jovial, sort of pleasant person, whereas most philosophers you read about, they all had terrible love lives. They all had like tortured relationships with women. They were all crotchety. They were all like Rousseau, for example, was absolutely weird. They were just. But David Hume was a very jolly chap.
That's probably what made his ideas so compelling and why they've lived on, but also so dangerous.
Yeah, so there's nothing to the self. We simply are. So when we turn to look inside ourselves, rather than Descartes seeing this thought and thinking that therefore he existed, Hume looks inside himself and just sees, oh, there's one perception, but another perception, but another perception, as if there's all he is just a bundle of perceptions. That's the exact phrase that he uses, a bundle of perceptions.
Now, so what was his relationship with the religious ideas of the day? Or
well, he was an atheist. I mean, he was a bit careful about it in his writings, but he was an atheist. So actually, that's the first philosopher.
He wouldn't have believed in the concept of soul.
No, or of God.
The thing I notice about I like to listen to Dallas Willard sometimes when he's talking about things like, there's a wonderful interview he did regarding a bunch of stuff, and somebody asked him, what is the soul? And he defined the soul as that which integrates.
Yes.
And he said, he said, plants have souls because there's something in a plant that integrates all of the whatever the soul is receiving, like sunlight and air and nutrients and all of that, and integrates it into a whole so that this plant can follow its telos to become. That's the soul. And it sounds as though when Hume is saying that he's nothing but a bundle of sense perceptions, that there's nothing that integrates that all together. So
yeah, I think that's exactly right. There's nothing that integrates. So in a sense, in a more extreme way than Descartes, there was nothing that integrated for mind and the body, although Descartes was well aware that was a problem. So it's the same for Hume, but there's nothing that integrates. So that's
maybe this would be a good place to look at Descartes' idea that there was nothing that integrated the mind and body, that the thought is separate from the body. I want to show you a little bit of this guy, Michael Levin, who, let's see if I can do this properly. Michael Levin is a researcher, and he is a biologist who used to be a computer scientist. So he's a very interesting thinker. Yeah. But what he has done is he's discovered that cells communicate with each other via bioelectric signaling. One of the ideas I found very, very interesting that he talked about in another video, not this one, is that why cancer cells can't stop growing, they just keep growing, is that a cancer cell decides to become rogue and not be a part of the community of cells anymore and just goes off by itself and starts proliferating. So here's the collective of cells all communicating with each other via these bioelectric signals, and they're doing this in order to help the undifferentiated cells determine where they go in the body to begin building an eye or an arm or something like that. And I'm gonna play a part of the video that doesn't reflect very well on Michael Levin's research, because I think this ties into the AI thing, but it also will help us to see something pretty interesting, I think.
Okay, great.
Why? Oh, here we go. Why is this a dead link? Huh. It's interesting. I apologize to my viewers. All of a sudden that video disappeared. Okay, you can watch me do this and see how very bad I am at, here he is.
The idea is,
okay, this part he's going to be talking about what they hope to be able to do with this.
You know, when can we all go home and say we're done? And the first thing that I show is what I call an anatomical compiler. So I think we need to get to the point where you can sit down and you can draw using a CAD-like tool, right? Like we draw, you know, car parts and things. You should be able to sit down and you should be able to draw the kind of animal or plant that you want at the anatomical level. And much like with computers, where you draw these things and you don't worry about where the atoms of each thing are going to go and what the, you know, you specify at the large scale, and then the compiler can give you the low level, right, events that need to happen for this to take place. The same thing. So you should be able to, you say, okay, I want something that's kind of like a frog, but I want it to have 6 legs, and I'd like it to have a head that looks like this and a tail and whatever else. And once we know what we're doing, the system should be able to go from that description to a set of stimuli that it would give to cells to cause them to undergo morphogenesis for that. That's our dream, you know, and are we going to get to see the full sort of general version of that? Probably not, but specific examples of that, I think, are absolutely coming. Yeah.
Right. And
so he's going to go on from here and talk about another thing that we'll look at later. But for right now, I just want to explain the backstory to this. What they discovered with this bioelectric signaling is that one of the things that biologists have learned about DNA is that it doesn't give the body information about where the body parts should grow. So like if you have a tadpole and it's going to become a frog, the tadpole's eyes and I don't know if it's a nose or whatever are on the face of a tadpole are in different places. And then as it becomes a frog, it has a morphogenesis that moves everything into the correct place. But the DNA is not telling it where to go. There's something else in the organism that tells these parts where to move as the organism develops. And they always wondered what that was. And he discovered that it's these communities of cells, undifferentiated cells, communicate with each other and tell each other where you go over there and build an eye, you go over there and build a tail, or I mean, get rid of the tail and build 4 legs or whatever. So this bioelectric signaling is that kind of a language that they're speaking to each other. And of course, he goes on to say, I'm not saying that there's any sort of teleology or any purpose in this, or, there is a goal directedness. And he says, but it's okay to talk about that because we've learned in computer systems that there can be goal directedness in computer systems. I'm like, yeah, but those are programs.
In computer systems, you have to put the goal in.
Yeah, it's so funny the way these people talk. But the point is, inside of us, and he calls it intelligences. There are intelligences in these cells that are communicating with each other via this bioelectric signaling. So our self is not only located in our thinking, our entire being is made up of parts that are thinking and that are goal directed.
Yes.
Right. And he talks about that to a great extent in the next section, which I'll play later. He talks about what happens if you remove a bunch of these undifferentiated cells from the organism and set them aside. Are they going to die, or is something else going to happen? And I'll play that for you in a few minutes, and then we'll have something to look forward to. But in the meantime, I thought this was interesting in terms of both Hume and Descartes. They didn't understand enough about what's the scientific truth that we know now about how our body is actually composed of all these different integrating capacities.
Yeah, I mean, I think the aspect of integration, I think, is really, really important, because one of the things, there are so many examples I think we could talk about in terms of how the way in which people are thinking about themselves and their relationship to other people, their relation to their self and to their bodies is just all disintegrating and also being fragmented into little pieces. So the ways in which people are doing body modifications, I think there's a really strong link between a lot of this with transhumanism, but also with things that are going on in transgenderism, the idea that you could just change from one gender to another, or have a myriad different genders, or even things like, I think recently I put out a tweet, I think you responded to it. I'd followed a thread on Twitter where people talking about ectogenesis, of growing babies outside the womb so that women didn't have to go through pregnancy. I think I did see that. Yeah. But, so the idea that we could, and there's talk about womb transplants so that men would be able to have womb transplants so they could have babies. But all of that relates around thinking of the body as if it's some kind of Lego system, whereby you could just take a uterus out of a woman and put it in a man, or rather than growing a baby inside a woman, you could just grow it artificially. But if we just take pregnancy as an example, human pregnancy, there's such a complex interaction of communication between the baby and the mother. So they share fetal cells. So they found cells from a fetus inside the mother's blood system years and years and years after she's given birth. And if the mother has, her heart is damaged, the fetus will send cells to repair the mother's heart. And it says if there's interaction between the two, and even actually Aristotle, the ancient Greeks were not known for their feminism. But so Aristotle thought that women were somehow like between men and animals, they were only semi-rational. But one of the things he said in the Nicomachean Ethics, which I just find really touching, he said that mothers love their babies more than fathers because they've known them for longer. So you know your baby in the womb. So there's that relationship. The idea that we could just, that's just one example of this really current idea that we could just chop our bodies around, modify them, as if they're nothing other than, you know, like a Lego system or one of those like play anatomy things where you can just take the organs in and out. It doesn't work like that, does it?
Well, and I think it connects up to this idea of trying to get completeness without consistency, which I think is what Hume is trying to do, get completeness without consistency. And this kind of came home to me when I was reading Matthew Pajot's The Language of Creation. Have you stumbled on that one yet?
Yes, I read it, yeah.
Yeah, so you remember when he's talking about time and space?
Yes.
And he's using space to represent order and time to represent chaos. And time or space in his lexicon is discrete, but time is continuous. And with time, you get completeness without consistency, but with space, you get consistency without completeness. Now, obviously, you need both of those somehow because those are both, each pole is complementary in some sense, right? So you need both of those, but if you try to do one without the other, you have a complete mess. So if you get completeness without consistency, by completeness, what I take that to mean is this continuous, like a spectrum. If you look at gender as a spectrum, and there's no place on that where there's a commitment to truth.
Yes.
It could be anywhere along this spectrum. That's what's happening to everything in our world today. Everything has got to be continuous. There's no, and that also makes me think of years ago when I first came back to the United States. I was working in an intercultural consulting company. And the big mantra back then was all cultures are equivalent. And that's what we were supposed to be teaching. And I'm like, oh, really? Did you ever read Peace Child? You know, where the highest virtue in that culture was to betray someone so that you could kill them and eat them. All cultures are not equivalent, you know.
I know.
There's a place, you have to make a commitment.
I mean, I come from Great Britain, the United Kingdom. My parents come from Wales, and I was born in London. And even as a child, going from England to Wales, it's different culture. It's noticeably different. It's people. So yeah, the idea that
their cultures are different, but what they were saying is they're all equally valuable, equally good. Right? Not just that they're. Yes. Of course, there's difference. I mean, that's why we celebrate diversity. But what we're celebrating is not actual diversity. What we're saying is that there is no real diversity because everything is equivalent, right?
Well, yeah. One of the things when I teach ethics, I try to knock relativism out of the students in the first class because otherwise a lot of them become unteachable. I mean, like extreme relativism. Obviously, some degree of relativism. You know, like in some countries, you take your shoes off before you go into the house, and that's kind of relativism is not undermining any kind of anything stronger. But one of the ways of demonstrating how erroneous that is actually by looking at time as well as space. So they're just thinking about space and culture in a different part of the world. But if we say that all cultures are like morally equivalent, that means there's no such thing as progress, because we can't say that our culture now is better than it was in the past when so for example, it used to be the law, it used to be perfectly legal for a man to keep his wife under lock and key and to beat her. So if we say that all cultures are equal, then we'd have to say a culture in which your husband is allowed to keep you locked up and to beat you is no worse than the current culture. So you couldn't have any idea. You can't have any idea of moral progress or even even judgment within your own culture. It just falls apart as soon as you.
That's a brilliant thing to force them to look at through time rather than looking at through space. And
Yeah.
why? So that shouldn't be. That seems so obvious, and yet it's so opaque to us, so hidden. Somehow people have made the concerted effort to hide time. Maybe this is why in so many of the universities, the young people resist studying Western civilization, because they would bump up against some realities that they don't want to face. This is why Western civilization's been banned from the universities. They don't want to study histories that might trigger them. They don't want to think about difficult things. You know how Tom Holland wrote that book Dominion, and through the writing of it, he discovered that there were really all sorts of things about those ancient civilizations that were just gross and disgusting and painful, and that the whole world has changed because of Christ. And he didn't really want to see that, right?
Yes, but yes, you must have heard him talk. If you read the book, you must have heard him talk about it.
I haven't read the book, but I've heard him talk about it. Yeah.
Oh yeah, yes. But the book is well worth reading, actually. And I went to listen to him talk about it in Southwark Cathedral shortly after it was published, and it was actually very, very moving, talking about it when he went to Mosul, and the Islamic State were just a mile away, and you could see where they were fighting. And he was standing in a town where people had recently been crucified, had actually been crucified. And he was just had this experience of just coming face to face with absolutely atrocious evil. So it was very, very moving, actually. But it would be, it's quite interesting. You quite often come across even sort of denials from quite a lot of people, even with something like Islamic State, about how bad it is. So I have come across people who, for example, would just like brush aside or deny what happened to the Yazidis, as if they can't quite register that that's something as evil as that is actually happening. It's quite.
I think it's because if you acknowledge, I mean, this is my guess about how things work. If you acknowledge the existence of evil, and if you actually let yourself ponder it's undeniable truth that God exists.
Yes, actually, I know people who've converted to Christianity through considering the evils of the Islamic State, because you think if there's such evil, there must be a countervailing force of good. You have to believe that.
But then, if you believe that, you also believe that there are certain consequential truths to not believing it. I mean, so it puts you in a bind. You have to commit. You can no longer just be this continuum of yes. Right. You have to commit.
Yes.
So we're on Hume. I'm sorry, we got kind of distracted.
I knew this was going to happen. The conversation was just going to go.
Well, I'm getting an education here. Well, I'm getting an education which I never got when I was in college. So I'm very appreciative to you.
It's very. I have to reassert. It's a very, very potted history of these things. But
that's okay. So Hume could find no ground for order in causation. He could find no ground for order in inductive reasoning.
Yeah. So to interrupt, his view is slightly complex. So he doesn't deny there was causation. So he just simply said that all it is constant conjunction. That there's no force out there in the world. There's no causal force. There's no order. So he believed in order, but he believed in regularity, but in nothing more than regularity. So that's, in a sense, that's why it's compatible with scientific method. Because in order to do the scientific method, you go. That's what you're doing, the observations. And you would draw inferences from the observations, but you don't actually, it doesn't make any difference if you deny that there's a causal force, as long as you're looking at the inferences and interpreting it.
So this clarifies a lot of things, because a lot of the scientists in the past who were Christians, they believed in scientific law because they believed that there was a lawgiver and that there was order in the universe, and that's why they could trust their scientific observations. But Hume is removing that pillar, and he's saying there is regularity in the universe, but there's no order.
Yes.
Now, that's a pretty fine-haired distinction, isn't it, between regularity and order? I mean, is there really a distinction?
Yes. Well, actually, it's the first philosophy essay I ever wrote, actually, he's got an essay on miracles. And he denied the existence of miracles. But the reason why he denied the existence of miracles is because he defined miracles as acting against, the normal run of what you'd expect in terms of nature normally works in a certain way, and then something miraculous happens, like you walk on water or the Red Sea parts or something. So, but then because he thought that nature always happened in terms of order, that miracle couldn't happen. But he also thought that they only ever happened a long time ago, when people were sort of primitive, because Hume had no problem with modern sensibilities about saying something dismissive about people in different countries or people from a long time ago. He quite happily described them as primitive. So we couldn't, and there's just a long chain of testimony. So it's far more likely that people are just making it up, because people in primitive lands or faraway places are more likely to believe in these sort of ridiculous things. And he, in his sort of cultured Scottish Enlightenment milieu, wasn't going to be fooled by it.
I'd really love to introduce Hume to Michael Levin, because along with this study in bioelectrical signaling that these cells do, they discovered that if they interfere with this bioelectric signaling by opening or closing an ion channel, that's all they have to do, they can tell this developing organism to build a leg, an extra leg over here that wasn't there before, just by opening or closing this ion channel, so that the organism itself signals to these cells, go over there and build a leg, and that the leg subroutine is already built into the organism, so that these cells know exactly how to build a leg. He doesn't, as a researcher, he doesn't have to tell them, well, when you're building a leg, you have to put in all these parts, and there has to be bones, and they have to have joints and nerves and all. No, the subroutine is there. You just signal the cells and they go over there and they build a leg. And the reason they're doing this research, unsurprisingly, is because there's a lot of suffering in the world, and they want to help people see and walk, and they want the lame to walk. But so here's how this stuff works. They took a group of cells. Well, I'm gonna show you this, because this is just kind of unbelievable. I think it's in this part right here. Let's listen for a bit.
But specific examples of that, I think, are absolutely coming. Yeah.
Right. And this programmer or a compiler will not just give us ability to heal, but it will also give us the ability to create living machines.
Yes.
I know you've been working on things called Zenobots, which are V.01 of what you are describing. So can you tell more about what are they, and how do you see them sort of evolving from here?
Sure. Yeah. The Zenobots, and the reason they're called Zenobots is because the initial ones that we made were made from cells from the frog called Xenopus laevis, and they're biobots, so we call them Zenobots. It was really an effort, and this is done in collaboration with our colleagues at the University of Vermont, Josh Bongard, in his lab. And the important thing about these Zenobots is that they're a first example of a much bigger emerging field that are basically synthetic organisms. And the idea is this is different from synthetic biology, where you're moving DNA between different bacteria and things like this. This is really designing new bodies along with new cognitive capacities that these different bodies are going to have. And the idea is, sure, we'll make some useful synthetic living machines, and they'll do things like clean up the environment and chase down cancer cells in your body, and scrape plaque off your arteries and things like this. But the deeper issue is that if we understood morphogenesis well enough to make bespoke organisms designed to a particular anatomical and behavioral spec, then all the problems of regenerative medicine would be solved, and you could build and improve biological structures at will. And so for the Zenobots, now one simple question there was even, is there even any plasticity? I mean, people talk often about developmental constraints, meaning that, hey, look, you're a zebrafish cell. What could you make but a zebrafish, right? That's the kind of the standard assumption. And so, and we before the Zenobots, we've had some interesting data on making planarians with head shapes that belong to different species of planaria without touching the genome, basically accessing different regions of that amorphous space bioelectrically. But we just asked a simple question. We said, okay, if we take some cells, in particular some skin cells from a frog, an early frog larva, we take some of those skin cells and we let them reboot their multicellularity. We let them sort of get together in a different environment away from the rest. We liberate them from the rest of the animal. We say, okay, you're on your own. There's a group of you. What do you want to do? And there's a bunch of possibilities, right? So one possibility is that they just die because they're single cells and they don't go on. There's a scenario where, well, maybe they just make a flat monolayer where they live in cell culture, every cell for itself, as reproducing as fast as it can. Maybe it might make a tumor. There's all kinds of possibility. What they actually do is something much more interesting than that. They really do undergo multicellularity in the sense that they coalesce, they combine, they come together, they signal to each other, and they form a new creature. And this new creature, why do I call it a creature? It has a very defined anatomy. It has behavior, so it has the ability to move around. It has various behavioral repertoires. It can do certain things. And the cool thing about this creature is that it doesn't look like a tadpole. It doesn't look like a frog. It doesn't look like anything you really would have predicted. It has a standard frog genome. So one way I often give talks about these things is I show 10 or 20 slides of videos of these things running around and doing various things and changing their shape and healing from damage and interacting with each other and interacting with things in their environment. And they say, what do you think this is? And people say, well, you found it in a pond somewhere. It's some sort of some sort of underwater creature. And I said, well, we have the genome. The genome. Well, that's great. Let's sequence the genome and we'll see what we learn. Well, the genome is 100% frog. It's 100% Xenobots. So this tells you right away a couple of interesting things. It tells you that cells have incredible plasticity, that they like working together to build things, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the default thing that they normally build. So in novel environments, they can build other things that are coherent, adaptive structures. So these things these Zenobots, they don't look like a mess. They look like a creature that might exist. It's just a completely different body plan, but it's perfectly serviceable for what they do, which is getting around and so on. So that's one thing. The other interesting thing to think about is that usually when you're looking at some sort of organism and somebody asks the question, okay, why does this thing see green light, or why does it have wings, or why does it jump, or whatever it does, the answer is always the same. Well, because for millions of years, its ancestors were rewarded for this or that. And so it has this long selection history towards a very specific outcome. Okay. The cool thing about these Zenobots, and these Zenobots are just the first steps of a field of this new field of computer designed organisms that are going to be new model systems beyond the standard, zebrafish, frog, mouse, whatever that people have been working with. There's an incredible option space for new types of bodies. And the thing about these Zenobots is that they don't have an evolutionary selection history back on Earth. They were created. They create themselves in 48 hours in front of your eyes, and
I guess that's enough.
Yeah.
They create themselves in 48 hours.
Wow.
Okay. Now, to me, that says two things. Maybe these people who have been saying forever that, of course, there has to be millions and millions and millions of years for evolution to have taken place, maybe need to consider this.
Yes.
That an entirely new species can be created in 48 hours.
Yes.
And
Well, actually,
also that all it takes to grow a new arm is to touch the electrical signaling in a body.
Yes.
Which sounds to me a little bit like a miracle.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Actually, I sat next to a professor of evolution at a sort of dinner a few years ago. and he admitted to me that he found it really hard to believe in evolution. But that precisely, he said he knew it happened, but the fact that it happened so fast, he said it is incredibly hard to believe that it's actually all those changes have happened so quickly. When you think about all the different changes that have happened, and the fact that if it's just random mutations, most random mutations are either neutral or harmful. So very few are going to be, and because if it's got to fit in with everything else that happens, it's actually really, really hard to believe it. So it was quite interesting to hear a professor of evolution at Oxford University said that as well.
Well, and the crazy thing is that I heard some guys talking about that like 3 years ago, looking at it from a standpoint of computer science. What are the probabilities? And the probabilities are so astronomical that it's completely uncomputable.
Yes, that in itself makes it a bit
3 years. When you think of how much more they've learned scientifically in those 3 years. I mean, this stuff this guy's doing right here that I showed you, this is right now stuff, okay? Think about the complexity of even the simplest organism, that even in a simple cell, it already has the capacity to communicate with other cells, and that capacity has to be there in order for an organism to differentiate and to build body parts in the correct place. That communication thing is prior to the building. So tell me how that just happens. I don't know. These guys don't face the implications of what they're discovering. If you listen, I'm going to list this video, and anybody that watches it, you'll hear it many times. The signal comes. The two of them will be talking, and one of them will start to say something that sounds a little bit like agency or a little bit like teleology, and they'll just back off and say, well, I'm not trying to say that, because I mean, evolution definitely happened.
Yes.
They do it over and over again. It's like they get right up to the edge, and then, yeah, no, it couldn't be that. So
yes, it's like, because David Hume thinks the world is regular, but it just happens to be regular. But what? How did that happen?
Yeah.
That's why he mentioned his essay on miracles, and it doesn't make any sense, because if it just happens to be regular, why can't it just happen not to be regular sometimes? Why couldn't it happen? Everything suddenly turns upside down. Why couldn't that happen? Why couldn't it happen that your jumper suddenly turns orange? Why couldn't that happen?
So then the third thing that you said about David Hume is that said he couldn't find a ground for inductive reasoning. He couldn't find a ground for a principle ordering and unifying of the self, which is just a bundle of perceptions. So that unifying of the self must be this integration thing that he was missing, right?
Yes, I think so. Yes, there's no, you just one. Yes, you have one sensation then another sensation.
So then you said, so this grounding in the empirical world becomes at the same time a divorce from it, which I think is about time for me to bring in this comment that Glenn, my physicist friend, made on a recent episode of The Meaning Code. I think it's a very interesting comment. He says, here's a thought to go along with the Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris Nature of Truth segment, you know, when they were having they did 4 debates, 2 hours long, on the nature of truth.
Right.
I didn't watch those because I don't like debates. But, they had a hard time coming to agreement on the definition of truth. So it's very hard to debate something that you can't agree on the definition of. So Glenn says, calling something the truth is the compliment we pay to those things that work. Okay, now if you just take that at face value, it sounds like he's a pragmatist, right? Utilitarian or something. But it's way bigger than, I think it's a much deeper idea. I really like this idea. He says, if I was to frame their debate and why it went nowhere, I would say that Jordan Peterson's worldview represents experiential truth, truth that is based on observation, experience, and experiment. And that sounds a little bit like empiricism, right?
Yeah.
While Sam Harris considers truth to be something revealed. That sounds counterintuitive.
It does, yeah.
Yeah, he says, I would guess that most would consider revealed truth to be something of a religious nature, more often than not involving some kind of sacred scriptures. But the definition of revealed is much more nuanced than that. Experiential truth is all you have when you're dealing with irreducibility or its complement, transcendence. Now, I really like that irreducibility and transcendence are two opposites, or not opposites, but they're on one pole. Transcendence and irreducibility, you know, the one and the many.
Right.
Computational irreducibility is just all this amazing complexity that we live in the middle of, and the transcendence is the one single unity, right? So experiential truth is all you have when you're dealing with that, the irreducibility and the transcendence. In contrast, revealed truth assumes that there is a shortcut to capital T truth that sidesteps real world experience. Now, this is where I liked your comment about empiricism dividing into, on one hand, you have a grounding in the empirical world, and on the other hand, you have a divorce from it. So there's something about empiricism that's necessary for us to live our lives.
Yes.
Every moment we're experimenting with the future in the next moment. If I do this, that's going to happen. If I do that, this other thing is going to happen, right? So empiricism is necessary for us to live our lives, but if that's the only thing, then we have a problem. But on the other side, if what you consider to be revealed truth is a shortcut to capital T truth that sidesteps this real world experience, you fall into a trap where revealed truth simply takes the form of pronouncements made by some assumed authority figure. We've been experiencing a lot of that lately.
Yes.
So I just thought that was such an interesting concept, because I've tried to think this through many times about Jordan Peterson's very pragmatic view of truth, that it really is experiential.
Mm.
At the same time that I know that there is an aspect of truth that is revealed. So it sort of became obvious reading this comment to me that both are necessary. And that's what happens with ideologies, incomplete ideologies that become crippled traps for people, is that they're either all experiential truth or they're all revealed truth, and they're not living in the balance of the two. Does that sound like I got it right?
Yeah, I think that sounds like a really interesting comment. I think and I think we can see. I mean, there's so many ways in which that could be taken forward, but there are so many ways in which the modern world has basically following Hume's path, which is then demonstrably breaking down, because so for example, the instrumental. Oh, no, this is a bit. I'm worried I'm going to be at so much of a sidetrack of what you're saying, but I think I'm just agreeing with you, just to give an example.
Well,
so this
go on to sidetrack. It's okay. Yeah.
This instrumental account of truth, which is then used the basis of the definition of intelligence built into artificial intelligence, means that, like in computing, we have to build the goals into the system. So you'd also contacted me a while ago. You're interested in super intelligence. So that there's a lot of people are putting a lot of work into how can we make certain that if AI takes off and develops into super intelligence, how can we protect ourselves? Because the worry is the super intelligence is going to take control of us and might have different ideas. So Stuart Russell, who's I think he's at Berkeley, I forget which university he's at. He's one of the leading AI researchers, and he's recently written a book called Human Compatible, where he's trying to find ways in which we can design AI to make certain that doesn't happen, where he's trying to make certain that we design AI which is geared around to learning what human goals and preferences are, and always instructed to make certain that it's designed along putting in human goals and preferences. But there's a number of problems with that. One of the problems being our goals and if it's simply based upon our goals and preferences, our preferences and desires, if they're just based in that empirical way, in like a Humean way of just our feelings of sympathy within ourselves, are so easily hacked. So we can create desires in people through what's advertising about, that's creating desires. You can create desires in people through things like a Skinner's sort of model of reward. You know, you keep on rewarding certain forms of behavior, you can create desires like that. You can create secondary desires. And our desires are being hacked all the time by the very technology that we're using. It's being hacked in terms of taking advantage of some fact about our physiology. So the little like button on Facebook is red because it attracts our attention. It's danger. That's, it used to be blue. They made it red because no one was taking notice of it. They're deliberately hacking it. They're deliberately hacking our dopamine reward systems. So it's being hacked also, I mean, in most hideous ways by the proliferation of awful online pornography, but even in, you know, more simple ways of using social media. They're deliberately hacking our desires and deliberately creating desires. So the very basis of this system that people like Russell are trying to use in order to try to protect ourselves from being taken over by AI, it's a flaw right at the heart of it. So we're already, there's a lot of concern about whether or not AI in the future might develop in ways which has taken us over. But it already has. It's already taken us over. It's already hacking what people do. And the average person spends 4.5 hours a day on a smartphone. We've already been taken over by AI. That's a hacking of a desire. Nobody was born. No.
Actually, 4.5 hours sounds kind of short compared to, I mean, as much as I am aware of all those things, I still will let myself just mindlessly scroll on Twitter for hours. And
yeah, because it's designed to hack our dopamine reward systems. I mean, they trot along to Stanford, I think it is, there's this famous course where they learn on persuasive technology, where they just learn how to do it.
Yeah.
So it's like a fundamental flaw in the system. If it's just all based on, so you'd asked before about Hume's notion of sympathy. Oh, you know, he just thought that human nature was fairly static. It's not, it can be so easily manipulated. Again, so when students are often start off by thinking of this notion of it as a preference-based account of ethics. It's like, that sounds really good, a desire-based account of ethics. And I said, oh, you know, have you gone out to, you know, have you got the latest iPhone? If you said, oh yes, they wanted that. I said, oh, I never wanted one of those when I was your age. Well, why not? Because they didn't exist. So where did your desire for this iPhone come from? It's natural. It's just been created. So, oh yeah.
Well, so that's one of the funny things that I think about quite often, is that aspect of marketing has built within it the seeds of our destruction, right?
Yes, yeah.
But at the same time, when I first moved to California, I was working for this intercultural consulting company, and one of the things that we did was train Procter & Gamble employees from Japan in how to interact with the American Procter & Gamble employees. So I had to learn the whole Procter & Gamble business culture, all of their cultural values and all of that kind of stuff. And we would take the trainees to, I think it's Modesto, has a big Pampers factory, or maybe it was Huggies, I can't remember. And I don't know if you've ever been in a factory where they make something like that. They're so fascinating. The machinery is complex and intricate and can do everything. There was this like 3-block long assembly line machine where the machine did everything. And some of what it did was it lays out this sort of semi-permeable fabric so that it breathes and it doesn't breathe, it traps things. It builds in a little cuff on the side of the diaper to hold the poopy into the diaper. It adds a plop of this stuff that's very absorbent. It puts the elastic into the legs so that it fits up around the legs of the diaper, you know. And it does all of this, and then at the end it folds them up nicely. It plops them in boxes. It stacks the boxes on a pallet. It wraps the pallet with plastic so that the whole thing can be put on a truck. Start to finish, this thing is just beautiful. But I'm watching that and I'm reflecting back on when my daughter was a baby back in 1970. She was born in 70. We didn't have fake baby diapers. We had only cloth. Okay. And then the first artificial, not artificial, what do they call them? The first diapers that were disposable, the first disposable diapers come along. And they were just exactly like the cloth diapers, but they were made out of something you could throw away, like some, I don't know, kind of like paper towels almost. And you just stacked up a bunch of them, and then you pinned them together on the side the same you would with a regular cloth diaper. And that was it. And of course, they'd leak and everything would come out the sides. But the marketing guys in Japan started trying to sell these things to the Japanese people. And the Japanese people said, no way, we're not going to buy anything like that. So, well, what do you need? Well, we need something that holds it in on the sides. We need something that keeps it from leaking, you know. So over the years, they worked with these Japanese cultural informants to tell them how to make a better diaper, and marketing produced these fabulous things that come out on these assembly lines now, which, by the way, I think have had terrible consequences because it's very hard to potty train a child who's never experienced wetness. But anyway, the idea is that marketing has produced a lot of things that make our lives simpler. And, you know, on the one side, on the other side, it's created a lot of things that right now are destroying us. And how do we find a way through the middle of that? You know, I don't think AI is calibrated to help us figure out those kinds of problems.
No, well, actually, so if I just sort of mentioned Stuart Russell's attempt to try to make certain that superintelligence doesn't take over us, his suggestion for it is, it seems cruel to laugh, but it's actually really hard not to laugh at what he's suggesting that AI should do. But we should train AI to observe human behavior and from that extrapolate humans' real preferences.
Oh, he didn't see Eagle Eye, did he? Did you ever see Eagle Eye?
No, I didn't, but yeah.
Oh, wow. You got to see that movie. Yeah. Okay.
But also, I mean, where has he been? Where?
I don't know. He must be a Humean, right?
Yes, he must be a Humean. But how could you? Yeah, it's just really bizarre. But how do you even know? But also, this is also a big problem. This has been a big problem so Hume is seen as a proto-utilitarian because he's got this basic idea that we're trying to sort of maximize the amount of happiness in the world. But, you know, our sympathy is that we should, you know, but we want people to be happy and we're against pain. So then the utilitarians proper came along after him. So Jeremy Bentham is probably, you say, the first, you know, famous, well-known utilitarian who was actually, he did an awful lot of legal reform as well. Actually, he worked. It's quite an amazing person, actually. One of these people who was very, very precocious. He went to Oxford when he was 12 years old and small his age, and studied the law. And one of the things that motivated him was actually seeing the inconsistencies and actually just fakery and deceit within the system of law and wanted to reform it. So a lot of people have got lots of real, you know, moral fibre, but his account of morality is based on pleasure and pain, on avoiding pain and trying to maximize the amount of pleasure. So his account is based. There's always a lot of sense and truth to these things, that the ideas go wrong when they're taken to extremes. But you can see it coming out of a Humean type approach, because he says that, and also a biological approach of people, because he says that mankind is ruled by two sovereign masters, which is for desire for, we want pleasure and we try to avoid pain. So from those two motivations, everything else follows. And from that other things being equal, he also thought that all pleasures were equal. So he said, other things being equal, pushpin is as good as poetry. So he thought that what we needed to do was try to maximize the amount of pleasure, but it didn't matter where the source of pleasure was. So one of the problems you have, because there's all sorts of different ways of trying to maximize our desires or maximize our pleasures, and if we're just simply looking at desires and preference satisfaction, then the question arises as does it matter what preferences we satisfy? So does it matter if somebody spends their whole life in the metaverse or spends their whole life scrolling online? If they're happy doing that, does it matter? So, and this also gets back to the ultimate question about reality. Does it matter if they're sitting there in the metaverse or sitting there putting their photograph out on Instagram through a filter so that they look more beautiful than they are, interacting with people they'll never meet, interacting with people who are also putting a fake persona out? Does that matter as long as their desires and preferences are being satisfied? So that's a kind of problem. That's a kind of problem we have now through how we interact in the world, but you can trace it coming up through this empirical way of looking at things. And it was it's been a major debate within utilitarianism as to if we just...
Okay, so here's a question. I have two comments. First of all, what's the difference between utilitarianism and pragmatism?
Oh, so utilitarianism is a doctrine of moral philosophy. So it's concerned with something different. So pragmatism would be concerned with how we find the truth. So utilitarian. Sorry, I realize I'm assuming that everybody will be familiar with it. So utilitarianism is a consequentialist philosophy. So
you're making it worse.
Okay.
There's all these things I don't know. Utilitarian is a doctrine of moral philosophy.
Yeah, so
and in contrast, pragmatism is...
It's an account about how you would reach the truth. You'd define truth pragmatically in terms of effects in the world or achieving your...
What works.
Yeah. Yes, what works, yeah.
Okay. So now, given that, I want to keep it as simple as possible because I'm a very simple person. Given that, I want to make my comment about this problem with seeing things just on the basis of pain and pleasure. I mean, it seems obvious that there's a problem there, but I have to think it through myself. One of the guys that I had on the channel here last year, or maybe 2 years ago, was Mark Solms, who has studied the origins of consciousness. And he has come to some conclusions, and he wrote a book called The Hidden Spring, the journey to the source of consciousness. And he had the best of intentions in writing this book, and it arose out of his curiosity about where the self resides, because his brother was in kind of a catastrophic accident as a boy, and the brother that he knew before the accident was no longer there after the accident. And so he wanted to understand how that could happen. So his account is, and I'm grossly simplifying, is that consciousness does not reside in the two hemispheres of the brain, or the origins of consciousness do not reside there. The origins of consciousness reside in the brain stem, which is, by evolutionarily speaking, much more ancient. And the brain stem's whole function long ago was to maintain homeostasis. If your temperature gets too hot, you got to get cooler. If it gets too cold, you got to get warmer. And that in his mind was the basis of value. That value arises out of this need to stay at homeostasis, which is basically a pleasure-pain principle, I think that's basically it. So in my mind, the problem with this is that it's locating the source of value in the creature itself, right?
Yes.
If there's no outside value towards, and so I don't understand how evolutionary people can think about this the way they do, because if there's no outside source of value towards which the creature is growing, why does the creature have any desire to survive? Why do they strive to survive? What are they moving towards? What are they selecting towards if there's nothing better out there? So
yeah, yes, I don't know why there was. That's a good question. I don't know. Yeah, that's a very good question. So
yes.
one of the, yeah.
Someday I want to ask one of those guys.
So one of the I think one of the problems with utilitarianism. So I was always in danger of going too quickly. So utilitarianism is a moral philosophy which holds that when we're deciding what the best thing to do is, we should think simply in terms of the consequences of our actions, in terms of whether or not it's going to bring about more pleasure or more pain. Or we could think of it in terms of happiness or unhappiness. So happiness...
But for who?
Well, actually, so that's a good question. So for utilitarians, so there is a bit of a problem. There's a very, very famous problem in how they try to argue this. So they would argue, so Bentham have very clearly argued that we should be focused on the happiness of everybody equally. So that everybody, so he had this philosophy, each to count for one and none for more than one. So for every single person, the happiness of every single person counts of equal importance. And then what each individual should do would be to try to maximize happiness overall in everything that you do. So of course there's an element of pragmatism, because we can have most effect on people close to us or things that we can actually do something about.
So is that kind of one of the foundations of Marxism? Because it sounds like Marxism built itself out of that.
Well, I don't know if Marx, well, it would be very close, but it's one of the foundations of,
it's this whole utopian idea from each according to his according to his ability and according to need.
Yeah, it is similar actually. Yes, it is similar, but it also, I mean, utilitarian thinking underlines a lot of thinking in public health actually, and in forms of government, because when you're making decisions on a big government level, you have to make pragmatic decisions across the population as a whole. So
Sarah Palin's death panels.
Yes, yes, it would be something. Could be something like that. Or, for example, supposing you're deciding whether to put in road traffic safety. There's a certain amount that you have to spend in order to save a certain number of lives. There's calculations they actually use. There's calculations in the National Institute of Clinical Excellence in Britain, which recommends treatments in the NHS. They have a calculation in terms of how much the treatment would cost per number of quality lives saved in order to give it a standard treatment. But the problem...
So it's putting the trolley problem into the AI that's driving your car.
Yes, yes.
Oh,
yes.
Great.
Yeah. So there are some circumstances in which you have to do something similar to that. So there's not limitless, there's never a limitless budget in government spending. So to some extent it's something we can't help. But of course, actually, we also have that in combination with human rights, so that you can't say take somebody's life in order to save somebody else's life. There's certain limits on it. So it's not pure utilitarianism, but in the absolute pure system, there's a sort of paradox that I think there's something that's quite good about it, in that it's taking the reality of somebody else's experience as being of importance. So I think it's most plausible in terms of taking the reality of somebody else's pain. So when we look back at the 18th and 19th century utilitarians, a lot of them were very effective social reformers, because what they had in front of them was vast sections of the population living really miserable lives, working in factories in really atrocious conditions, and living in lives of great poverty. So one of the things that motivated Bentham in law was that law was a way of taking money off people for no good reason. So stamping out those kinds of things, I think it's important to see that these things are not just completely misguided, that there's a plausibility to them. And there's a plausibility to wanting people, happiness is a good thing. But I think one of the problems...
How do you balance... I completely see what you're saying, is that when you have a situation where the law is being used to take money unrighteously away from people who are poor, can't afford it. I mean, this is one of the things that came up during the Ferguson riots, was that in Ferguson, there were a lot of arbitrary laws on the books that would allow the police to stop people and fine them so that they could get the money for the coffers of the city to run on. But at the same time, the people that were the poorest were the ones that were being most affected by these things.
Yeah.
But if everything is based on that principle, then it stands to reason that in order to equalize, then you need to take the money away from the people that have a lot more of it in order to, right?
Yes.
So you start running into problems right away. So it's computationally irreducible in a sense to try to figure all this stuff out in a way that actually can accommodate the best for every single person.
Yes. So there are lots of different, there's sprung up lots of different forms of utilitarianism and lots of different ways of trying to solve those kinds of problems about how it should be distributed across a population. And there are people still working in those things and having increasingly sort of ornate and complex ways of trying to do it. But I think one of the ways in which a problem comes in straight away is because we're just simply looking at, here's a bit of pain, here's another bit, here's a bit of pleasure, and there's no integration or meaning. And especially if you're thinking that all pleasures can be reduced to another, you could swap one thing for another. So I could, maybe kill your husband but give you loads of money instead or something. But because you could just equal it out. It comes along with a maximizing principle. So what we have to do is try to maximize the amount of happiness in the world with no upper limit. And that's all we're trying to do, is to maximize. So that's the sort of problem that comes up in AI with super intelligence. The idea it's just going to try to, you give it an instruction, it's going to try to maximize it. And there's something really paradoxically wrong about trying to maximize. So that's the sort of thing that happens in, so the sorts of ways in which the social media is hacking people's dopamine rewards. So the sort of thing that happens in addiction, you're just maximized to just keep hooked into something. And as a matter of fact, actually, there are classic thought experiments that when students are studying utilitarianism, they would think about to try to imagine what kind of situation you might like to be in. And so try to show the paradoxes behind utilitarianism. So one of them is called the experience machine. I think the philosopher Robert Nozick first thought of it. So would you like to be hooked up to a machine where, a bit like the Matrix, where you were just plugged into something, so you had experiences that were very, very pleasant, you never suffered, so you were maximizing your pleasure, but none of it was real. And I do this in tutorials and ask undergraduates if they would like to be in the machine. So most of them don't want to be in the machine, but find it hard to explain why not. But in my experience, about a third of undergraduates say they want to go into the machine. Usually the boys, and I think they're doing it just to be a bit provocative. But this is exactly the problem we have now, or more or less the problem we have now with partly with social media, but also the suggestions of this metaverse suggestion that Mark Zuckerberg wants to come out with. We are actually really heading to something very, very close to the experience machine. And if you're
it really illustrates, it's like a perfect picture in real life of Jordan Peterson's argument that either everything matters or nothing matters.
Yes.
You can have either one. If nothing matters, and then you can have this world where you don't have to put forth any effort.
Yes.
Great, it's easy, but eventually you end in nihilism, or everything matters, and then it's hard.
Yes, very hard. And we get situations arising already. So, for example, these men who are married to sex robots, people are marrying them,
or women are married to themselves. Yes.
I don't mean to pick out men in particular. It happens probably slightly differently between the sexes, but yes, or married to themselves, or no sense of connection to something.
And I don't know if this is true or not, but the other day I heard that some school system, I think it was in the United States, the school board had approved putting litter boxes in the bathrooms for those kids who were identifying as
furries.
Kittens or
furries?
Furries.
Yeah. You know about furries?
No, I haven't heard about furries, but
yeah, furries are.
Is there an expectation that the litter boxes will actually be used, or was it just a symbolic move? I mean, are these children going in and squatting on the litter box? I mean, I
have no idea.
We obviously have a lot to talk about, Paula, and we only got through the first paragraph. So I think we probably need to call it quits now.
Yes, I know.
And get back together again soon.
Yeah, there is so much to talk about because I had so many examples of how what's happening online or what's happening in the way in which we're using technology is it's changing our perception of reality, it's distorting it, but it's also distorting our sense of ourselves and our connection with other people. Because, oh yeah, there's more we can talk about, but just like maybe as a little trailer of stuff we can talk about next time. The sense of a real through the senses is, I think, so Hume was wrong in lots of ways, but the idea that we just get a sense, you see a sort of patch of blue or something, and then we get the impression in our minds, and then we in contact with reality that way. We get a sense of reality through many things, through triangulating our senses. So the fact that we could, I mean, I can touch my computer screen. I can't reach out and touch you. So, but in real life, our senses through the sense of touch and smell and taste and sound all come together. And actually, in the piece, it mentioned 5 senses. I think it might be quite important to add that we've got more than 5 senses because we've got the proprioceptor sense and the vestibular sense, which I think are critical as well in our sense of reality, because of the fact that we can orient ourselves to the world is critical in how we understand it. The fact that
do you also think that imagination is a sense?
We could talk about that another time because that's really interesting. Yeah. Because one of the things that Hume was definitely wrong about in terms of how we form ideas, he said we get a sensation in the world through perception, and then we form an idea of it, which is like a weak copy of a sensation, as if all of our ideas of the world would just be like in visual imagery or sound imagery. But lots of people have no visual imagery. They just don't think like that at all. So I recently came across a research network, the Fantasia network, that's doing work on this actually, because people vary enormously in how well they can visualize and how much they have imagery. So some people just have none at all. So they obviously think, they obviously think, a friend of mine who's a philosopher pointed this out to me a few months ago. She just doesn't think in imagery at all. So he was just completely wrong about that. But
I don't think I think in imagery. In fact, one of the things I used to say about myself when I was younger, which I really believed to be true, is that I don't actually think at all most of the time, unless I'm interacting either with a book or with some other thinker or with a person. Most of the time, I'm not walking around thinking. This is what I thought of myself when I was younger. That's kind of what I mean when I say that when I started listening to Jordan Peterson about 4 years ago, my brain kind of woke up, because somehow I was willing to start doing the hard problem of thinking about some of these problems and trying to figure out where the answers lay. So now I'm thinking all the time. It's like my brain is just on go all the time, right? Even in the middle of the night, I wake up in the middle of the night and I've got all these things in my head I'm trying to figure out. So, I mean, there's a good and a that's bad about it. So next time, let's talk about how there's more than just 5 senses and what those senses are and what they actually mean, and bring it back. I do want to come back to this whole idea of love and the postmodern predicament, and I'll just read one sentence from it. If we interpret beauty as nothing more than a mental feeling, so to speak, then this has implications for the meaning of appearance more generally. Specifically, it implies an extrication of appearance from its source, a denial that appearance is the self-showing of an actually existent thing, the revelation of a reality. If beauty has no relationship to reality, what does this imply for our perception of the world more generally? So I want to bring it back to this idea of the connection that beauty has to reality, because if we lose beauty, his contention is that we lose reality. And if we lose reality, obviously the game is over, right? So, and that somehow beauty is the thing that AI cannot understand. Now,
Yeah.
so let's get together again.
That would be great.
Yeah, looking forward to it. Thank you so much, Paula.
Thank you so much. It's always such a pleasure to talk to you.
Complete. I mean, I'm just like buzzing right now. I got so many ideas. Thank you, Paula. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.